Hi, welcome to this video on overcoming childhood trauma with NLP. I'm Lindley Craig, NLP trainer, and I'll be your guide through today's video. So let's get started on kind of a big overview about what we're going to be talking about. So we're going to start with why we're learning about childhood trauma and how to overcome it. And we're also going to talk about what we need to know to be able to do the NLP processes, because there's two really important things to know and for me to kind of teach you before we get into the how of how we do the NLP process that's related to overcoming childhood trauma. And then I invite you at the end of the video, as always, to notice, what did you notice in the video? And what did you notice during the process that we went through about the childhood trauma? Is there anything that came up for you? Is there any kind of memory or something that was triggered? Or did you learn something new? So I invite you to kind of just notice what you learned. All right, let's get started. So first of all, childhood trauma normally brings up a bunch of different kinds of negative emotions. So our childhood traumas or traumas that happen to us in any point in time in our lives, they have a tendency to trigger either these negative feelings of fear or guilt or hurt or anger or something like that. Now, when I was growing up, I unfortunately had a sister who got sick, and I was probably around 12 years old at the time when she was diagnosed with a spinal cord tumor. So what had happened during that time was that my sister had slowly deteriorated from the person that I used to, run around with and play with and go to the pool and things like that, like normal kid stuff. To somebody who was no longer able to walk and who had to go through the entire experience of learning how to walk again. Unfortunately, the tumor had come back after the first surgery, and so she had to go through that entire process over again. So just things like balancing and learning to walk and things like that were quite difficult. Well, the tumor was quite persistent, so she ended up with a brain tumor and unfortunately passed away. So all the time that I was growing up, I didn't really realize the effects of this sort of trauma had on me until as I continued through my adulthood, I would have all sorts of really triggers to my emotions that would bring me back in time to when my sister passed away, or sometime during the time that she was recovering that really hurt me. And I would have a flood of emotions that would come out. And that was really difficult for me at the time. And it wasn't until I went to an event by Anthony Robbins, and some of you know Tony Robbins, who's a big motivational speaker in the United States. And Tony Robbins got his start by learning NLP. So he was doing a process on, the 3,000 people in the room and myself about some things and negative things that have happened in our past. And it was the first time that I had clarity, but a clearing of this negative emotion that I had that sort of kept being triggered through my life. So just because we have a childhood trauma or we have something that happens to us that is bad from our past, doesn't mean that it has to continue to affect our adulthood or our lives in the future. So there is a way in NLP that we can stop that. And so sometimes in our adulthoods, we'll also find that these little things will start bubbling up from our unconscious minds, and they'll start trying to, what we were referred to as revealing themselves or presenting themselves to us. So we might have a memory of something that we haven't thought of in eons and decades or what have you, and it will sort of present itself for us to deal with at that time. So this is somewhat how traumas come up and sneak up on us. All right, so with my situation, I had a very, very cool experience that I was able to let go of a lot of the guilt that was associated from me not thinking that I loved my sister enough while she was going through this really hard time and trauma in her life. So before we go on to learning how I dealt with that particular situation and how you can deal with situations in your life from your childhood or even just from your recent past, there are two things that I really need to talk to you about. And one of them is called timeline, and the other is Gestalt. And that's kind of a funny word, and I'll kind of explain that more. But first I want to talk to you about timeline, because that's the kind of the basis of how we work with things that occur in people's lives in NLP. So we all have this sort of metaphorical understanding of time, so that it kind of evolves on this line where there's a distinct past, a distinct present, as well as a distinct future. So when you're speaking to somebody, you will notice that they might always gesture to the same place in their space that indicates for them past, and a place that would indicate present, as well as a place that would indicate future. And you can get a feel for this when you watch somebody speaking about the past, present, and future. And timeline is really important to us as far as our ability to go back kind of in time and be able to sort stuff out. So it's like that we have the events in our lives and they sort of mark themselves on our timeline as we go through time. And that's kind of also an important thing, because it's going to come up again when we get into the Gestalt part. So our timeline, everybody has this sort of metaphorical understanding of timeline. And all of the places that we refer to can be different. So for some people, their past might be behind them, their future might be in front of them, and some people might have their past to the right and their future to the left, or vice versa, or they might be in sort of angles or what have you. And some people have their present inside them, and some people's present is outside them. So if you consider now, if someone asked you where now was, is now inside you or outside of you? So some people have now just like in front of them, might be a little bit further in front of them, but some people have now like inside of them. So we do all sorts of fun things with timeline in NLP, and the process that we're going to go through a little later on is exactly that kind of thing that we use timeline for. So timeline, that's kind of the first understanding, the understanding of this metaphorical past, present, future, and that you understand that as events go through your life, and they might be significant events that come through your life, that they sort of mark or lay themselves on your timeline and at a certain point. So let's look at this other thing called Gestalt. So Gestalt, basically, I'm going to kind of read you some information about Gestalt. So it's a physiological or biological or psychological or symbolic configuration of a pattern of elements so unified as a whole that they properties cannot be defined by simply a summation of their parts. So that's a really, really big, long way of saying that we have these significant emotional events that go through as we go through our lives. That one significant emotional event gets connected somehow to another event, that's connected to another event, that's connected to another event, that's connected to another event. And they sort of all get triggered simultaneously when we get triggered in something. So our feelings of guilt or fear or anger or hurt or something like that can have all sorts of these significant emotional events connected together. And so that is kind of what a gestalt is. It's sort of a conglomeration of related and sometimes non-related memories that create this gestalt. So, putting that together with our timeline. Oh, before I forget, the person who NLP modeled to get this particular part of psychotherapy or psychology into NLP was Fritz Perls, who is sort of the father of Gestalt therapy. And so this is what they took from the Gestalt therapy, was this understanding of significant emotional events and how they are sort of placed on our timeline and linked together. So sometimes we don't know what the cause or the trauma was that created all these significant emotional events to be linked together. So we don't know the origins sometimes. And sometimes we think we know what the origin is, but we really don't. So for example, I had a client once who was having some problems with presentation skills. And he was okay presenting to people who were junior to him, so his subordinates or staff members or somebody who was on an equal level. But when he had to speak to people who were above him, who there was any kind of perceived level that was above him, then he had quite a bit of a problem. He would literally freeze in his tracks and not be able to say a word. And so he hired me to help him with his presentation skills. And at first, he told me that he believed that this problem that he had was related to an old boss that he had. And this old boss was very critical, and she was, every time he spoke, she sort of interrupted and chastised him and put him down and things like that. And so he believed that she was the one who kind of instigated all of this trauma for him and his inability to speak. Now, I wasn't really convinced about that. And there was a couple of things that had happened during our coaching sessions that led me to believe that there might be something else in the mixture. So what I did was use a type of hypnotherapy process that allows us to go back and find the source of a particular feeling. And what we found when we did that with that particular client was that he had a situation in school where he was bullied by older students in the school. And it was such a vivid memory for him. As soon as it came, he all of a sudden realized that it really didn't have anything to do with the boss. It really had to do with this. And that was the beginning, whereas the boss was part of the gestalt, part of all of the things that triggered this particular behavior for him, this fear of presenting to people who were superior or above him. So sometimes we think we know, and sometimes we are wrong, and sometimes we don't know at all where it all began. So for those two things, the timeline and the gestalt, you have now enough information to have a clear indication of what we're going to do next. And then the next part is the how. How do we help somebody, or how do we help ourselves to clear childhood traumas or other traumas that have happened in our lives? Now, this is just one process that we have in NLP that you can use. There are others as well. So we'll get to that later. Let's look at the how. So in the how, what we're going to look at, or what we're going to experience, is a belief change process, an emotional belief change process. So what we're looking at is we're looking at tracking the belief back in time, tracking the emotion back in time through our timeline, and allowing our unconscious mind to basically create all those little dots on the timeline. that will allow us to travel back using that emotion as our guide, to travel back to the first time that we had felt that emotion in a strong way that would create that significant emotional effect for us. And so we're going to go back and follow our timeline to that point. And then we're going to just double check and look further into the past to make sure there's no little more dots on the timeline. And then we're going to go back into the event. And sometimes people will see the event very clearly, and sometimes people don't see the event. They might hear sounds or they might have a feeling, but it's not complete for them. So whatever you experience is perfectly okay. So we're going to look at that event or listen to that event or feel that event, however it appears to you. And we're going to just check in with that event, and we're going to notice the feelings that we have. Now, being in the event itself, it means we're associated into the event. So we're feeling the feelings of that emotion. And so the other thing that we want to do is we want to quickly decide, or we quickly want to find the decision that we made about that event at that time. So it's just really helpful to ask yourself, at that time, what did I decide about this event? And whatever decision it was that you had, then we're going to basically kind of float back up above the event. And then it kind of makes it a disassociated event. So we're not in it. We're not necessarily feeling the emotions. We're sort of just looking above it into it. And so that helps us to, if the emotions are very strong, that we're not in that emotion or in that event too long, so that we're not experiencing those negative emotions for too long. What we want to do is go in, experience that emotion, check that decision, and then float back up again. And so we're checking the decision because we want to know, what did we decide about life? What did we decide about other people? What did we decide about the world around us? So oftentimes, especially when we're children, we make really broad generalizations about what has happened to us, and we've made rules about the way life is because of this event. So we want to check into that decision because oftentimes that decision doesn't serve us at all. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to float further into the past before the event actually occurred. Now, by doing this, basically what we're doing is we're saying, then we don't need to, the event itself hasn't actually happened yet, so the emotions aren't even there yet, right? So we're leaving the emotions behind, and we're just before the event kind of knowing that event's coming up. And we're just double checking, like, what other resources would we want as the kind of grown-up person we are now? What kind of resource would we want to give ourselves in that point in time so that this experience could happen in a different way? So this decision that we made would be a different decision. So you see how this is going? Because once we do that, and once we give the resources that child or that view of that version of us needed at that time, then the decision can be different. And once we change that decision, we change our entire outlook on the way it happened, the way we look at the world. It's never too late to have a happy childhood. So we can change that decision, we can change the way we look at stuff, and then we can float not only past that event, but all through the other events and clear them as we go. Because now that decision that we made about that is now gone. So we can go float into not only the present, but into the future. And when we're in the future, we can look further into the future and say, if that same kind of thing would have happened, not that particular event, but if the same kind of emotion would happen to us in the future, then how would we react? Because now it's so much different. And so once we realize that, we can flow back to now, and the process is over. Now, I'm going to actually record the entire script for this so that you can listen to it on its own. So it'll be in the video just below this video so that you can listen to it all by yourself, and you can pause that video as we go through the process so you can track it in your own pace. All right? So I'm going to do that for you so that you can go through it at any time for any kind of trauma or experience that you had in the past that you want to try to clear, try to find the decisions about or what have you, or add some resources to something that's occurred in that past. All right, sounds good, huh? Now, this isn't the only process that we use for trauma in NLP, as I already stated. So another one that we use is the fast phobia trauma cure, or the trauma process that we use for things like post-traumatic stress disorder or phobias or fears. And that's a different process that we can use that maybe perhaps if this particular process doesn't work for you, you can find an NLP coach that would guide you through that particular process. Sometimes the process, it's about what works for you as the client rather than the NLP process being the best, right? So it's what works for you. That's the most important thing. Anyway, so that's another process that we can use, and there's all sorts of other NLP techniques that we use that can come up when, as a coach, you're working one-on-one with somebody. So for example, if I'm working with somebody and they might have a decision that, a part of them wanted to do this and a part of them wanted to do this, I might do a parts integration within this emotion belief change kind of process. So an NLP coach, an experienced NLP coach, can help you through those kinds of things. And because there's an interaction between the coach and the coachee, then, obviously the benefit is much better. So if you do have lots of little childhood traumas that you want to get over or get rid of or clear completely, then I highly recommend getting a NLP coach. Fabulous. Anyway, so the other thing that you can do is keep clearing the things that are coming up. So if your unconscious mind starts delivering stuff to you, like you just all of a sudden remember this bad event from your childhood or from the past, and it sort of was triggered and you don't know why it's triggered, then look into that event and see if there was any decisions that you made that might be kind of ruling your life in the present. And then even if you don't find any decisions, maybe think about the resources that you would have liked to have in that event and just sort of put that imagination together and get those resources into that event and see how then it feels, because I'm sure it's going to feel much differently. So the other thing you can do is keep watching this video over and over and over again, because the more you go through it, the more you can clean and cleanse stuff out. The other thing is somebody had asked me about the process has a lot of visual aspects, so you're imagining going down into the event and things like that. The thing is you can also guide yourself through emotions or through voice. So if it's an auditory event for you, just guide yourself through the auditory sense of it. Or if it's a feeling event for you, guide yourself through it as a feeling event. And one of the things that I recommend is, whether it's an auditory or a feeling event, is that you take that feeling outside of you, so that that feeling then becomes a symbol of some sort, and allow that symbol to enlighten the event. So perhaps maybe that the darkness that you see, or that you don't see anything, is the feeling is so strong and your entire emotion is wrapped around the feeling. So allow that feeling to actually create a symbol, and that symbol to be able to lighten the event. It might be just a light switch that's the symbol, and you just turn it on and all of a sudden you can see everything in the event. It's cool. So anyway, your brain works really well that way. It loves symbols. It loves that imagination aspect of it. So it can do all of those things if you allow it to. So play with it, and if you want some more guidance, go and find an NLP coach. All right, so that's it for this video on How to Overcome Childhood Trauma with NLP. And I am Lindley Craig, and I'm hoping that you will see me in the next video.